welcome to Roundtable. I'm your host, Adam Cooke. This week, the Member of Parliament for Cape Breton-Canso, Mike Kelloway, visits our Telile studio in Aleasha and sits down with Telile General Manager Becky Bourinot. And we're going to spend much of the rest of this week's Roundtable talking about the recent cancellation of the Petit de Grat shark fishing derby by the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Petit de Grat was one of 3 remaining communities in Nova Scotia holding shark derbies, the others being on the South Shore in Lockport and Yarmouth. However, earlier this month, DFO officials confirmed that the 3 remaining shark derbies in Nova Scotia will not proceed this year. We're going to talk about this with one of the key organizers for the Petit de Grat Shark Derby in recent years, Aleasha David, in just a couple of minutes. And later on in the program, you're going to hear from the perspective of the Ecology Action Centre as we speak to the Associate Director of Marine Programs at the Centre and talk about how their involvement in the Derby over the years has them looking with several different perspectives at this time of cancellation for Petit de Grat and the 2 other derbies. But first of all, here in its entirety is a statement provided to Telile Community Television just last week by federal DFO officials in the Maritime Region Office concerning the Shark Derby cancellation. The following statement was prepared by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Maritimes Region for Telile Community Television regarding the cancellation of shark derbies in Nova Scotia. In previous years, Fisheries and Oceans Canada has authorized shark tournaments through the issuance of scientific licenses under Section 52 of the Fishery General Regulations as a way to support the department's science requirements. However, the department's research program no longer requires new sampling through this license, and we communicated this to shark tournament organizers and other stakeholders last year. DFO provided shark tournament organizers 3 alternative options for holding authorized shark derbies. 1. Tournaments authorized through the issuance of a recreational license that permits catch and release, which would allow tagging but not landing. 2. Tournaments authorized through the issuance of a recreational license that permits retention, which requires human consumption of the catch in order to avoid waste. And 3. Tournaments authorized through the issuance of a scientific license with the support of another organization, or DFO in the future as needed, that requests scientific study of a shark that would require the shark to be landed in circumstances outside commercial fishery bycatch. The decision to proceed or not with any of these options, and the request for any applicable required license, rests with shark tournament organizers. So now you've heard the reasoning from the DFO as to why the 3 remaining shark fishing derbies in Nova Scotia were cancelled this year. And you've also heard the criteria under which any of these derbies could go forward in future years. So what do local organizers and residents think of the cancellation in Petit de Grat? To get some perspective on this, I spoke to Aleasha David. She's been working for many years at the Marine Research Centre at Universite-Sainte-Anne's campus in Petit de Grat. And she and her colleague, Michelle Theriault, the director of the Marine Research Centre, have been acting in an observational and science monitoring perspective at the Petit de Grat Derby since it launched in 2011. And as well, they've taken on leadership roles that are closer to the action in recent years. With the cancellation of the Derby, I felt that it was a good idea to speak to Aleasha David to get her perspective on the whole issue. So I caught up with her via phone late last week for Telile Community Television's Roundtable program. Here's our conversation right now. So Aleasha, thank you for joining us today. One of the big reasons that we did want to speak to you about the situation involving the Petit de Grat Shark Derby was because we were curious about the involvement that you and your colleague from the Marine Research Centre, Michelle Theriault, have had over the years. Can you tell us a little bit about what got the 2 of you involved and what roles you served during that time?
Yeah, so I actually wasn't as involved the first year that they had it. It was a group of fishermen that kind of sat around at a party or somewhere and decided that it would be fun to have an event like this in the area. So they kind of pushed it forward the first year, and our involvement really took place when DFO started getting involved and having someone doing sampling at the wharf with DFO. And from there it kind of grew to help them with their committee and organization and how we could move forward with it. And now both Michelle and I are on the committee, so every year help organize the event. Yeah, from start to finish.
Okay, so what kinds of things were you looking for, you and Michelle, in terms of making sure it was carried out properly and working both with the local fishermen and with DFO? What kinds of things were you folks in charge of?
So at the beginning, we actually worked closely with DFO and some of the science. So when they were coming to the derbies, the idea was that they were collecting certain information on the sharks that were being landed. So sizes, maturity work, dissections, stomach contents. So making sure that they had shark on the wharf, and that if they needed assistance in getting any of that information, that we helped do that. From there, we became involved a little bit on the organization side of it, so sponsorship, preparing everything beforehand, rules, regulations, making sure that everything was following protocol for DFO, and then, of course, taking the day of making sure everything worked out smoothly. So registration, the licensing was set up. The day of, we helped at the wharf, both with the dissections, but also with measuring weights as the sharks landed, the length measurements for the winners. So really just carrying it out till the end of it.
The two of you worked carefully with DFO and with the local fishermen on the various things you've just mentioned. So with all that in mind, were you surprised or caught off guard at all when DFO announced that it was going to shut down the last 3 shark derbies in Nova Scotia, including Petit de Grat? What was your reaction?
So when we first, it wasn't a one-time meeting. We did discuss it several years ago, the idea that this might be coming, it might have to happen. The way the licensing always worked is it went through DFO Science. So Science would apply for a main license for the event with the idea that they were collecting information on the shark when they had it. And they did warn us that as the years went on, because of the size of the sharks that were being landed, being very restricted, there's only so much information that they needed to collect or could collect on those animals. So there's all kinds of information they don't have on shark. But shark, those sizes coming in from those derbies, they were at the point where they felt like they had enough information to learn from it, and that they probably wouldn't be applying in the same way or getting a license in the same way so that they could get that information, because it wasn't going to help them moving forward with science. So they did warn us a few years ago that this might happen. And then come last year before the derby, actually, they told us that that would be the last year that they would apply for the scientific license, and that we might have to consider other ways if we want to continue having the derby, and how we could do that.
So let's talk just a little bit about that. DFO released a statement not too long after the cancellation went through and mentioned that there would be 3 criteria that would be required for a derby to be able to go through, one of them being that it would be a catch and release event, the other being that if indeed the derby was allowed to proceed, then the meat that was brought in from the sharks would have to be consumed, and that there would have to be a scientific justification to be able to see the derby going through for research purposes. So did you get the sense that basically the way the derby was going in Petit de Grat, based on the changing criteria from DFO, that it wasn't going to match any of those 3 main conditions that were being put on it?
So it makes it difficult. So for us, we really took this year to step back and see if anybody else was able to do it through those criteria. There's concerns with having to do a catch and release on how we would go about doing it. They've done it in other fisheries. They do it with tuna. So we are still inquiring about how that's happening in other places and whether or not there is a way that we could apply it here. In terms of biological sampling, we don't see it as a fit here. There were other groups in the province that were exploring that option to see if it was a possibility. As you said, nobody's moving forward with it this year as far as I know. But they are considering it. And in terms of eating the shark, blue shark is really not a shark that's used for consumption much. So as of right now, we don't see that as an option. But all 3 are being considered, and we're not saying we're out of it for good. We just took a step back to see if there was a way that might work in the future. As of right now, we didn't know how that would work or how we could do that.
In the meantime, just taking a snapshot, Aleasha, of the local community and the reaction, obviously this was something that coincided with the Festival Acadien de Petit de Grat for many years. What do you feel the reaction's been to the community, and especially from the fishermen that you've been hearing since the news got out?
Oh, some of the fishermen are disappointed it can't move forward. But we are trying to make them understand and work with them to see if there's a way around it. DFO has a point, and the reason they're not applying for the permit makes sense. So we're understanding of that, and it may be that we can't have it again. But we're exploring the option of having it some other way with the fishermen that are interested. We have several fishermen on our board, and we're just trying to see if there's any way we can get around it to see if they can still have the event.
One last question to you, Aleasha. How do you feel personally about all of this? I mean, obviously, this was something that you put your time in over the years to make sure it was running smoothly. You approached it from a marine biology perspective. How do you feel about the way things have shaken out this year and what things might look like for the future, if anything?
I think I'm coming from a very scientific view, so for that reason, I understand where DFO is coming from. So for us, a lot of the interest was on the wharf and that scientific work that was happening, and we are losing that anyway. So from that side, I understand. Obviously, I think there's a whole educational component to it, and I think a lot of the other derbies are feeling that hit, maybe even more than we are, because they had thousands of people come to the wharf in some areas. It was an opportunity to teach kids, for them to see stuff and learn about the sharks. And even that in itself, if we can take some of that back somehow, would be nice to see from our side.
I know that this is all coming together quickly, and I appreciate you giving some time to me to help discuss this. So, Aleasha David, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, no problem.
And later on in this edition of Roundtable, I'll speak to the Associate Director of Marine Programs for the Ecology Action Centre, Shannon Arnold. She has some interesting perspectives about the Ecology Action Centre's observation role with the derbies over the years, and what could be done to resurrect these events in communities like Petit de Grat going forward. But right now, you may have noticed that Cape Breton-Canso MP Mike Kelloway has been seen more often in Richmond County over the past couple of weeks. There are reasons for that, and MP Kelloway discussed some of those reasons, along with several other topics of importance to our local viewers, with Becky Bourinot, the General Manager of Telile Community Television. That interview took place here in the Telile Community Television studios in Arishat just last week. Here are some of the highlights.
We are always happy to see you. But if you're in the area, I know there's a reason.
Well, absolutely. We, this morning, announced monies for seniors programming. And for 4 organizations located in Richmond County. And this summer I've been going around making announcements, and the reason why I make these announcements obviously is to let people know about them, but it's a result of a lot of hard work with myself, my staff, and those organizations across the riding. It's so important, and in particular seniors. So we're making a lot of announcements, and over the course of the next 2 weeks, a lot more announcements with respect to seniors and food security, and just in general programs that focus on social isolation and mental and physical health for seniors in the riding. And we're so blessed in this riding to have so many organizations that are doing such great work. So we've been working on that, and of course, Becky, we were talking before we came on camera, we're talking about this past year, and we've made about $5 billion investment in Nova Scotia healthcare, which is going to be significant for the province to be able to administer it effectively over time. It's going to take time, but the province is the lead on that, but we've provided historic monies for healthcare, and I'm glad to be a part of that. And dental care and $10 a day care. The climate incentive payments are going to go out to individuals next week, and they'll come around every quarter for individuals. And the idea is that we see this no matter where we go, that because of inflation, the Conservatives will say that Justin Trudeau created inflation. It's worldwide inflation, partly caused by COVID, partly caused by, in a major way, the war in Ukraine. We understand that people are hurting, and that's why we've been putting out measures on affordability, such as the grocery rebate and other elements like, as I mentioned, the climate incentive plan to get money back into the pocketbooks of folks. That's the work that I'm interested in. And then you look in our riding, and you look at the developments in the Strait area with respect to green hydrogen. This is real, Becky. This is tangible. I'm very excited about this, and as an MP for the area, playing a lead role and working with industry and working with the province and working with my own federal government to ensure that we make the right investments for Nova Scotians, Cape Bretoners, Northeastern Nova Scotian, the region, the country, and the world. I believe the world will be looking to Cape Breton for green hydrogen and offshore wind. I'm excited about it. Lots of work to do on it. But those are some of the things that are certainly getting me excited. And then next week we come back to Airshad again, Almadam.
Right.
We're going to be making a pretty significant announcement on boat building for the area, which means jobs for the area. And that all happens because we work together.
Well, considering that, we have a long history of boat building.
Absolutely.
Couldn't happen to a better place.
Well, what is old is new again. Mm-hmm. We have expertise, but we also have need. And, the federal government needs vessels, and we're going to provide them here in Airshad. And that's a big deal in Almadam. I always say that great things can happen in rural Canada. I'm a staunch rural constituent. I believe the best is yet to come. We have a lot of work that is going on in different pockets with respect to green hydrogen, offshore wind, boat building, tourism and hospitality, and the list goes on. But it's an exciting time, and we do have our challenges. We have our challenges with respect to child poverty. Now, the Canada Child Benefit, I think since we instituted it 7 years ago, has helped take close to 500,000 children out of poverty in Canada. Hundreds of them are in our riding, and we need to do more investments like that. Consequently, you have a conservative leader, and I will call him Pierre, Mr. Poilievre, who talks about cutting. Cutting, slashing, and chopping is how I would describe it. If you watch Mr. Poilievre, and I want to get real for a moment in terms of politics, I think there's a definitive choice in the next couple of years when there's an election. There's a right-wing approach that looks at cutting costs, that looks at pitting people against people, region against region. We see some of the nastiness in terms of his viewpoints on LGBTQ. We see his divisiveness around taking, again, region against region and trying to get municipalities against each other. I like to think the best of people. That's my approach. But I have some concerns about this man. I have some concerns that it is seemingly looking like right-wing politics from the United States. There are chapters that are written verbatim out of the Trump playbook. I don't think that's what Atlantic Canadians want. I think Atlantic Canadians want government to work effectively, make strategic investments in Canadians. And my concern is pretty evident from what I'm saying here. Now, what I do believe is that we need to have cautious optimism. That doesn't mean we have rose-colored glasses optimism. We look at things authentically, realistically. We have a lot of opportunity in Cape Breton and Northeastern Nova Scotia for those watching across the country. In many instances, our population is increasing because of newcomers and people coming back. We have businesses that are starting up in our respective counties in Cape Breton and Northeastern Nova Scotia. That is something to be proud of, but we can't stop there. So where a conservative federal party looks at cutting programs, which impacts you, I heard Mr. Poilievre in the House chamber talk about we need to look at reducing the investment in EI and old age pension. He calls it a tax. What he's saying, by calling it a tax, is that the investments that we put into the kitty, he wants to lower them, which means, in my opinion, OAS and EI are not invested fully in. These are serious times. These are serious challenges. When we get to positivity, that's where I'm at. When you get to negativity, no one wins on that. We need to have debate on the issues. We need to know what plans are in place from the government perspective. But what would the opposition do? What would the opposition do on healthcare? They talk about that we need to slash spending. So is Mr. Poilievre suggesting $5 billion should be cut? He's never said that. He's never come out to say what he means. For me, I get up every morning, and we've had this conversation. I get up and I think about whether I'm in Ottawa or here in the riding. How do we make this place a better place with the people that live in it? We have talented people. I just came from an event where we made an announcement for 4 community groups. Those are the leaders. Those are the people that are making things happen. I'm jazzed about the opportunities that are here. I'm going to continue to work hard for the people. And I'm going to keep communicating through platforms like this. Because when you get your news from Facebook, we talked about this, anybody and their dog, as they would say back home, anybody and their dog can post something that looks like a story about someone, about some opportunity, about some challenge. But it's not journalism. This is cutting through, and this is cutting through the social media noise and talking about things that matter most to constituents, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Well, you know, I think it's fantastic that all these new programs are coming. And I mean, let's face it, we all know, I mean, I know, and I'm sure you are aware, as is the rest of Nova Scotia, that this is a province that is known for working together as a team. And I'm not really sure that everybody in Ottawa understands that we are in rural communities, and that rural communities act a lot differently than the cities, right?
Absolutely.
So, you know, I see the newcomers coming, and in some rural communities, it's like, well, you know, we don't want the from-aways. Well, I see that differently. I see that as new people coming in, bringing new ideas, and I'm excited about that. That excites me.
Me too.
As far as the green energy stuff, that is fantastic.
Well, you know, when you look at the weather events caused by the climate crisis, and climate change is here, we look at the last 10 months in Cape Breton Island in northeastern Nova Scotia. In 10 months, not a full year, we've had a once-in-a-lifetime hurricane and massive fires on the mainland. Now, what's the economic cost? If you just looked at the economic cost, put the social costs over here and the personal costs over here, we're looking at $1 billion because of Fiona, and probably it'll get to $1 billion because of the fire. So in 10 months, the cost to Nova Scotians is $2 billion. And people will say, well, climate has always been that way. No, it hasn't. This is not normal. And we need to take measures that focus on tackling the problem head on, while at the same time looking at the affordability items that impact everyday people. We could choose as a country to put our head in the sand. That's a choice. But you can only do that for so long. And we need to work with the people of Canada, people of Nova Scotia, to talk about the price on carbon, but also the carbon pricing rebates. And all the other measures that, you know, I didn't even touch upon dental care. That's significant policy. A disability framework to ensure that in time we'll get more investments to people that have disabilities. So it's a puzzle, and you can look at one piece, but you got to look at the whole puzzle and say, this piece locks into this piece in terms of affordability, this piece does as well. It's a bit of a mosaic, and that's, you know, multiple programs. It's not one program that is going to address affordability. But we have a climate crisis in Nova Scotia and in the world. Some people might say, well, you know, China and India are not doing their part in terms of carbon pricing. I would agree with that. But they're also paying the price with hundreds of thousands of people dying because of poor quality air. So these are challenging times. These are transformational times. The way we bring people along, in my opinion, is having an honest conversation, and not having debates on social media about it, or between a premier and another federal official. It's having honest discussion around the climate crisis, how it impacts people individually, socially, and economically. And how do we mitigate emissions? And the price on pollution, right now, before the carbon pricing went into effect in July 1st, it was free for industry to pollute. Free for industry to pollute. You know, that's wrong. But it's also wrong that people don't get the benefits of the price on carbon back to them. So the price on carbon is like this. The rebate focuses on 90% comes back to Canadians, 9% goes back to business, 1% goes back to First Nations. The government of Canada does not keep that tax. No. It goes back to people, right? Now, I won't get into provincial federal debates because I don't think that serves us well. What people expect, and every constituent in Cape Breton-Canso should expect this, is that the provincial government and the federal government work together. That we hash out our differences behind closed doors, and we come out with the best product for Nova Scotians. That's been my philosophy. I work exceptionally well with all the MLAs in my riding. Why? Because I go to them or they come to me. We don't have debates on social media. Why? Let's get the job done. It's about getting results for Nova Scotians and Cape Bretoners and Northeastern Nova Scotians.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that whole idea and notion of dealing with things behind the scenes, you know, working together.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense. And when you post something on social media, it can get blown out of proportion to the point where it's just absolutely ridiculous and the message is lost.
Absolutely.
And then, you know, you don't get to focus on actually addressing the problem. No. So, I mean, I appreciate that you do it that way.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm grateful to have collaborators and partners in that provincially and municipally. You know, I work very well with all MLAs, as I mentioned. I work well with all councillors and all chiefs. Doesn't mean we don't have disagreements. Doesn't mean we don't have challenging moments. But if we keep our eye on the prize, which is helping each and every one of you, then we'll get to a better place. When we get in front of a podium and say, look at me, look, I'm disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing, that doesn't serve anybody any well.
No, it doesn't.
And it's not my style, it's not my approach. No. Now, my approach is sometimes aggressive, but I will never be sorry for fighting for the people of Cape Breton and Northeastern Nova Scotia, ever. And I want to pick up one thing that you mentioned. Rural Canada, rural Nova Scotia, there is, I believe, a rising tide in terms of opportunity. And we need to get behind that as everyday taxpayers, as local politicians, provincial and federal. One particular opportunity is around renewable energy. And this part of the world, Atlantic Canada, has tremendous opportunity. It will come with hard work and time. But that is the opportunity in front of us. It enables us to do things like, you know, fund announcements in Shetty Camp that we'll be making in a couple of weeks. It'll enable us to make announcements in Pomcat that we'll be making in a couple of weeks. So, you know, interesting times that require leadership, that require a steady hand, that require being honest and empathetic. That's been my approach from day one and will continue to be.
A lot of people don't like change, but you know, the winds of change are upon us.
And I get that.
Yeah,
change is scary, and at the same point, we are at an inflection point, I believe, in a couple of areas. The environment and how it impacts Nova Scotians, how it's impacting Nova Scotians. And also the body politic. It used to be left and right. Now it's about people that believe in institutions, believe in law and order, believe in the power of people, and those that want to tear that down. And I will tell you this, as long as I'm in this position, I'll be fighting for building people up as opposed to tearing them down. And it comes with hard work, time, commitment, empathy, but also focus.
Right, and you have to look at the future.
Absolutely.
Always, you have to look ahead all the time.
You should go where the puck is going to be.
Absolutely.
Right?
You know, I look at economic renewal every day. I think about that, economic renewal. What can make us different from everybody else? What can help us? What can help the what can help the community around us? And I don't see it as being one small community. I see it as being a large community, you know?
1,000%. Look, a benefit to for example, a benefit to the Halifax port, a benefit to the Belford port, a benefit to the Sydney port is not a zero-sum game. It's not at the expense of one over the other. We need to focus on clusters. How can these work together? How can we focus on looking at new opportunities that result from being unique, sometimes being competitive, but always working together? I have meetings with people that are center, center-right, right, left, center-left, left-left. I'll always do that because you need to listen. You need to try to put yourself in the shoes of other people. Doesn't mean you capitulate your views.
So what announcements did you make this morning, just out of curiosity?
Well, we made 4 announcements to four different groups. So it about $82,000 in total, but enables, you know, Kingston Memorial Hospital, for example, is one of them, and they do such great work.
Oh, they do.
Right?
They do.
The Telile Seniors Group is another one. We made another announcement there. And those are just 2 examples of what we did today. Now, we're going across the riding over this summer, making many more announcements. because it takes time to get to that point.
Of course.
But also you want to go to those that put so much work in to make those announcements so that the community can share in the good news, that the community can see the hard work that the community group in question put into the proposal that got the funding. We're not going to stop making announcements. I'm basically living in my car for the summer. A joke, insert joke, an irony there. But when you have a riding my size, which is quite large, you have two choices. You can do this job behind a desk that I don't think serves anybody any well, or you get out there.
It's not your style anyway.
Yeah, my style. But we have announcements coming in Shetty Camp in the coming week or two that are significant. Pomquet that are significant, Richmond County that are significant, and they're around economic development.
Perfect.
Right? So stay tuned, and you'll see them on Facebook and other media, and we'll do this again. We can do a recap.
You just keep moving around the way you do, because I can't see you sitting at a desk job ever.
No, I can't see that either. It's nothing but an honor and a pleasure to work with and work for people. So.
And I know you have a bunch of hard-working staff members.
I have Natasha, I have John Patrick, Connor, Megan, Tamika, and Maya.
Wow.
And they work primarily out of the local office, and I have one person in Ottawa. The best team.
So it must take a lot of people then to keep you in line, Mike.
In particular, Natasha. Yeah, Natasha does a good job at doing so. But we've got great Nova Scotians working in our riding with me, and I look at it as a team. And I'm only as strong as the work they do, and I mean that sincerely. It's a team effort, and everyone is always, every day, game on.
Well, thanks for coming again.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you again.
Okay.
And just a programming note, we weren't able to run the entire interview with Cape Breton-Canso MP Mike Kelloway on this week's Roundtable due to time concerns. However, you can see the whole thing in its entirety on Telile's YouTube channel. Right now, let's return to the cancellation of the Petit de Grat Shark Fishing Derby, as well as the other two remaining shark fishing derbies in Nova Scotia. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans put out its statement just last week regarding the cancellation of these events and what would be required for them to be resurrected. To get some perspective on this issue, I sat down recently with the Associate Director of Marine Programs for the Ecology Action Centre. Now, some of you may be surprised to know that the Ecology Action Centre played a key role in the management of the shark derbies over the years and sat on an advisory board with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and with local organizers. So, what does the Ecology Action Centre have to say about the reasons behind the cancellation of the derbies this year, and what could be required for the derbies to go ahead in future years? To get the answers, I sat down with Shannon Arnold of the Ecology Action Centre. Here is our conversation right now. Joining us now on Telile Community Television to offer the perspective of the Ecology Action Centre and its Marine Programs Division to the cancellation of shark derbies in various parts of Nova Scotia, including Alma Dam. We are pleased to welcome Shannon Arnold, who is the Associate Director of Marine Programs for the Ecology Action Centre. Shannon, thank you for joining me on Telile today.
Great, thanks for inviting me.
Well, we're pleased to get your perspective on all of this. And one of the things I wanted to begin by asking you about is, what was your immediate reaction to the news of the cancellation of the three remaining shark derbies in Nova Scotia? It had been discussed at the DFO level as far back as the previous fall. We've seen other derbies being canceled and ending over the last couple of years. But what was your immediate reaction to the news that came out just a couple of weeks ago?
Well, we also sit on the advisory committee for the shark tournaments. So we kind of knew this might be coming down the pipeline in the sense of just the restrictions that have been placed over the last number of years on different species and on what is useful for the blue sharks. So I wasn't, too surprised. However, I think a lot of people would assume the Ecology Action Centre is against all shark fishing or something like that. But actually, we support sustainable fisheries, and sharks are fish, and every fish could be theoretically sustainably fished. So it's nothing that we've never opposed the shark tournaments, because They're relatively small, and they are now focused on blue sharks. And we can talk a bit more about why blue sharks have a more healthy population. So from the point of view of something that people probably don't know that we do as Ecology Action Centre, we do a lot of community economic development, and a big part of our marine work is coastal livelihoods. So both fishing, aquaculture, tourism stuff. And so in some ways, while we're not a super fan of just killing the sharks all the time, in some ways, it is a bit disappointing to see a coastal tournament go away that did bring in tourism dollars, and that did have some importance to local communities for economics and for coastal cultural issues for fishing. So we have mixed feelings about it, and actually we think that there are ways that the derbies could continue.
So we'll get into that in just a moment, but can you tell me what your relationship and that of the Ecology Action Centre was with the overseeing of these shark derbies and these particular competitions? You mentioned that you'd sat on an advisory board overseeing all of this. So what kind of communication did you have with DFO and with the organizers of the shark derbies, and what kind of information did you provide?
We were just observers, really. I mean, we have a seat on that committee. We are primarily focused on commercial fishing work, and so we sit on all of the advisory committees for the fisheries in the region, and have for a long, long time been very vocal and very involved in the management of the commercial shark fishing, and that as a bycatch to swordfish fishing. And we also go to the international level of management and have been involved for a decade or more, which is where the rules are set for things like sharks, swordfish, billfish, all of that. So we're super involved in that commercial side of things. In terms of the tournaments, we have sat on the advisory committee, and we ask questions as other stakeholders. So we're just another stakeholder on that committee, and we're able to sit there and ask questions to the scientists, to DFO, about the rules, about the guidelines. They were putting together guidelines for catch and release and for charters in the last few years. So we sit there with a similar voice at the committees to look at conservation angles, handling, and to support the tagging work and that kind of thing that's been done. But we didn't really intervene per se in are they going to manage the sharks? When the tournaments were still able to catch poor beagles and makos, which are both endangered, we were at the table. We didn't agree that those should be able to be caught. And so we agreed with the management decisions to come and remove those from the tournament. But we've always being pretty quiet and not said too much about the blue sharks, because blue sharks are a healthy shark population. So yeah, that's how we've been involved as stakeholders on the advisory committee, where the derby owner operators also sit. And, it's their tournaments and their businesses. So we're there for interest and just to make sure we understood the situation from their perspective as well.
Now, you mentioned blue sharks a couple of times, Shannon, and it's my understanding that it's this particular species that is a big part of the reason for the cancellation of these derbies. What can you tell us about the blue shark population and about the concerns linked to them in terms of how these derbies are run?
Well, as we speak, actually right now in Spain, which is again, it's the international level that does the assessments for blue sharks, because they, as a population in the North Atlantic, range across the entire North Atlantic. So right now, this week is a new population assessment for blue sharks. It hasn't been done now for 7 years, I think. So we're all waiting with bated breath to see, where their population is trending. But the last information that we know, they are relatively healthy compared to other shark populations. And that's because they're a little bit more robust. So sharks in general, we have to be more precautious with, right? Because they have very few pups. They have very small litters, and they have so it's harder for them to maintain that reproduction. And so you have to be very careful about how much you're taking out of the populations. Blue sharks have a couple of things going for them. They have higher reproductive rates. They also are more resilient to being caught on a hook. So they have lower mortality rates when they're going to die compared to some other sharks, in terms like makos and poor beagles and that kind of thing. And they are the number one caught shark commercially. But from the point of view for us, they're not really landed and used that much because, well, there's lots of reasons, but because their meat isn't as good as for straight up use, like mako sharks are, which is a good meat shark. Like you don't have to process them in any way, really. Blue sharks have this really high urea content, so their meat has to be processed in some way to really eat it directly. So they are used still for fins and stuff like that. But all of that to say, generally the population of blue sharks has been relatively stable compared to many other sharks, which are like just declining. We will know more when they release the new science. But so from a population point of view, the tournaments and how many sharks they're taking out of the water, it's like 60 per year, something like that. It's like the tiniest dent in the population. So there is, at the international level, is where they set the quotas. It's the first ever shark internationally that ever had quotas set for them. And that happened in 2019. And we worked really hard with Canada and other countries around the world to get that passed. Because even when a population is healthy, just like any other fish, we should know how much we're taking out of the water, and we should have a limit to that. So at like the North Atlantic level, you're allowed to take 39,000 tons of blue shark out of the water. So, the tournaments are taking 5 tons kind of thing, right? So, the kind of scale that we're looking at in terms of concern around how much the impact is for the derbies on blue sharks has never been like a conservation population concern for us, because it is such a small amount. Even our biggest concern, and that's why we're really vocal at the table on the commercial fishery for swordfish, because every year annually they're catching 1,500 tons here in Canadian waters. They're not keeping barely any of them because there isn't a market for them. So not all of those are going to die. About 23% or so is what the stats are, right? So when you dehook them and you chuck them back in the water, 25% of those are going to die later on. Some of them are already dead at the side of the boat, but like the vast majority are going to be released alive, and they're relatively robust, but still they're, killing several hundreds of tons of sharks every year in our commercial fishery with no limit. And so, what we're looking for management is always like, okay, are we counting how much is coming out of the water? Do we have limits on that, like we should for tuna and every other thing that they catch? And, is that okay in the sustainable TAC that we're given, the total allowable catch you're allowed to have? So in terms of the derbies, that's why we've never been like vocally in opposition to blue shark. And so it's a little strange in some ways in our opinion as to why the way the permitting has worked for the derbies and the route to that, which is what ended up leading to the cancellation based on just blue sharks being left, right? So the way that my understanding is from a DFO perspective, the way that the tournaments have been kind of permitted, because they're not a commercial fishing permit, is that they've been permitted through a science license. And therefore, there had to be some sort of scientific reason for the tournaments to continue. And when they were doing porbeagles and makos, and then on also blue shark, you have a lot of samples. The scientists would come down and do samples, and people would tag them. And that was giving some information into the population assessments. And so because blue shark is the remaining shark, which it should be, the other endangered shark should not be caught like to kill, because there's barely any that we should be touching, so that's fine. But the blue sharks, because of it's a science license that was given to the derbies, and it's not enough information really when you're talking about 60 sharks to contribute to the assessment, when you're looking at 39,000 tons and like several millions of sharks in the North Atlantic, right? It's the commercial fishing data that really is useful for the assessment. And also there's a size limit that was put on the derbies several years ago. Again, probably a good thing to make sure you're not catching juveniles and you're going for some bigger ones that have already reproduced, right? However, that also limited the scientific information that was coming in, because basically all the tournaments are now catching are large males. And so we know the information about that, right? Like DFO doesn't need the information from the derbies. And so because the permitting route was through that, now that science information is too narrow to use for population assessments, DFO, I guess, is saying like, well, we can't give you a permit.
One of the three justifications that DFO is now giving shark derbies to continue to exist is that there must be some scientific research merit coming out of this. But it almost seems like they're giving a lifeline that doesn't really exist to the organizers of the shark derbies, because DFO, in its statement on the cancellations earlier this month, had already said we don't feel that there's any scientific justification for these types of things to go ahead. You find that to be a bit of a conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're thinking about it from a specific angle. And, they have left that door open from the science point of view to say, like, if there is, because there's certainly a lot of research still to do on blue sharks. Let's say, maybe a researcher from an institution might come forward and want to put acoustic tags on them, but you'd have to release them alive to get that. Or maybe they want to look at stomach contents for a certain reason or something like that. So there might be an institution that comes forward to better understand shark diet or different things. So there's certainly space for researchers to come forward and say, I still want to find this out about blue sharks. DFO, the science they need is just for the population assessment, really, right? So there is that little bit of a door. However, if you're looking at the tournaments from a different angle, which is community economic development or fishing impact, and is this okay in terms of sustainable impact, then I wonder, like, why there isn't an option to give a quota to the tournament, for instance. Now, this is an interesting thought, right? But it hasn't been put forward. As I said, we're looking at several, depending on how you do the math, if our commercial fishery is interacting with at least 1,500 tons every year, 25% of those are going to die later on. We're already killing in the commercial fishery. We're already killing. They're not keeping them. They're discarded dead, or they die later on after they've been released, right? And we're not really using them for blue shark meat per se, which is the other option tournaments in beginning, is to like eat it, which I mean would be good if you're killing it. You don't want to waste it. That would be a nice non-wasteful way of using blue sharks, would be to eat them, which is great. But the other option would be to think about, is there a way that they could give them a quota, right? Which is what we would like to see for all fishing that you're doing, whether it's recreational or commercial, that we know, like, okay, 80 sharks or whatever that might be, 50 tons of shark or 10 tons of shark could come out of the water. We're going to set that aside for tournaments, which is something similar to what they do for bluefin tuna tournaments. So we have a very specific amount of quota for bluefin. Every single fish in the North Atlantic must get tagged because, the population is still recovering. And so in order to allow the couple of bluefin tournaments that go ahead, a specific piece of that quota is agreed upon by the stakeholders, and that's given to that tournament so that they can use it. But we know exactly how much they're allowed to take. You can count it, and we know it's within that sustainable population box that we've been given. So now that we have at the international level, we know the tons that are allowed to be taken. Canada is, the way that it's working is that European Union is given almost all of it. It's like 30,000 tons. Japan is given 4,000 tons. Morocco is given 1,600. And all the other countries that are catching blue sharks are required to keep their current catch at the same or to lower it. Okay, so we have space to work with here to potentially give the tournaments a very small quota. And I know that that's like a little out of the box thinking for DFO because they're not commercial. But, if you're thinking about like the justification from a conservation point of view, you could do that. They've also given an option for catch and release. And we would be like, we have said at the table, like, we're fully supportive of catch and release. It is, there are more and more catch and release tournaments happening. And we look to the US where there's like a massive sport fishing economy, right? Recreational fishing and sport fishing tournaments are huge. And there's two like equally sized organizations and associations that run them. And one is fully catch and release and another one is kill. And you can't do kill for most sharks anymore anyways in the US. So there are lots of catch and release tournaments now for large like for the billfish and for sharks and tunas in the US. And they've figured out different ways to do that. That makes the tournament economically viable and interesting, and people are into it. So those are two options we think would be a good way forward, to continue to have some, and you could, the one that isn't kill is probably our preference, because you want to be precautionary with sharks. And it would take some doing, but I think that's something that, they have been told, I think, as derbies that could go forward would be catch and release.
Now, I'm glad you brought those up, because obviously those are the other stipulations that DFO has put forward, that there could be a catch and release element, or that the amount of shark that is brought in does have to be consumed. Now, we've heard from organizers of shark derbies in areas like Lockport that they are only ever able to consume a small percentage of the sharks landed during the derbies. You mentioned just a couple of minutes ago the idea that shark meat, especially with blue shark, is very difficult to prepare. So I want to get a little more thought on you, the idea that this offer has been put forward by DFO, that if you catch it, you have to consume it. Do you feel that might wind up just not being practical in the long run?
Yeah, I think it's probably not that practical for folks. It does. Blue shark in particular needs to be processed in a certain manner. I would also, maybe not, but there is some concern about the fin trade with blue sharks. The sharks that are blue sharks that are landed through the commercial fishery are all for fins. And so it is an interesting condition to put on the derbies, because that's not a condition that I've ever heard of for commercial fleets, that they actually have to consume the sharks that they're bringing in. And blue sharks is a perfect example. Now, for sure, for like poor beagles, which they're still allowed to bring in, that's all like it's you'll see it in stores still. It's like good, it's meat and fins. They utilize the whole shark, which would be the goal. But for blue sharks, there just isn't a market here for meat. And I have never heard a condition being put on them. Once you land it, you market it in whatever way you need. And so they're marketing just the fins generally for blue shark. So it seems to me just a little odd that would be a requirement from the fisheries department, which generally their management and rules are all around the sustainability in terms of catch and conservation and how much is coming out of the water. We've often argued that you want full utilization of all species, but they usually say, well, that's not our job. So it's kind of an interesting one that's come forward for the derbies. And I don't know why that would fall under, usually a DFO says, like, that's not under our mandate, is like what you do with it once you get to the market is another person's issue. We've run into that trying to argue in other places for them to make sure the commercial fleets use their catch, right? So it's a kind of a fascinating one in that sense. And it would be difficult to, not impossible, but it would be difficult to process blue sharks in that same way. So I think the catch and release option ends up being, for what's on the table right now from DFO, catch and release option ends up being the easiest way forward.
Well, I want to wrap up this interview, Shannon, by asking you, from the perspective of the Ecology Action Centre, it seems like this has been quite a tightrope walk between your organization and DFO, and also the organizers of the local community shark derbies, taking all of these factors into account. So can you describe what it's been like for you and for your colleagues being a part of all this, and whether there's any wistfulness on your part at the idea that the derbies are being canceled for the time being, and whether they could ever be resurrected in the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we often, we play an interesting role in our work in fisheries management and in shark management in particular in the broader conservation community. Like I said, I think there's a lot of assumptions. There's kind of two camps in the shark conservation community. And one is seeing sharks totally as wildlife, and that no matter what shark you're talking about, even if it's a healthy population, it should be protected and not touched. And another camp, which we fall into, which is we support sustainable fishing, like I said. And so sometimes if we are really vocal about allowing any shark fishing, that's why we've been generally quiet in the public about the derbies. It's like other conservationists that come and cause some issues for us because they're not really keen on that position. Whereas we're saying if the population is healthy, if it's well managed, just like any other fish, we're fine with that. So that's why we've been a little quiet over the years on the derbies, because it just creates craziness. But, you know, I think that a little wistful. I mean, I don't like the idea of waste of life. So like just landing them to kill them, you know, I think that there could be some really creative ways to get the derbies back. Like I say, like to make sure it's economically viable, to have like you could reimagine it around education around sharks as well. Like it was really cool when they were doing the science at the dock, because a lot of people would come down and learn about blue sharks and stuff. But you don't need 60 sharks to do that. You just need a few. But, you know, so you could reimagine it as a celebration of that wildlife, as well as, you know, fishing as a way of living and recreational fishing as an economic opportunity for people, right? And so, like I said, like the catch and release tournaments are making money in the US. There are different ways that people are doing it. Some of them have like a chase boat that goes out there because they're all in a relatively close area. And they like, when someone's hooked a shark, the like rule boat goes over to like help them do the measurement and take a picture before they release it. You know, you can do it with audio visual nowadays with, you know, on the side of the boat. So you'd have to, and there's good guidelines around safety and handling and all of that so that you have the shark in the water and stuff. It's not, and they're doing it with like much more scary sharks, hammerheads and stuff like that, right? So it's possible. And I just think it's one of those things where you're like, why can't we all work together to come up with a bit more of a creative pathway here for what from a conservation point of view is relatively small and could be a conservation positive if we reimagine like the way the tournaments are done, right?
Well, we appreciate you taking some time for us. We've learned a lot in just the last few minutes, and we appreciate you explaining the Ecology Action Centre position on this, and we look forward to seeing where it all goes from here. But in the meantime, thank you, Shannon Arnold, for joining us here on Telile Community Television today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Shannon Arnold is the Associate Director of Marine Programs for the Ecology Action Centre. We've been speaking to her today via Zoom from her home office in Halifax. And there you have it. That wraps up this week's edition of Roundtable. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to my interview guests this week, Aleasha David, Shannon Arnold, and Mike Kelloway. And thank you to Telile's Becky Bourinot for carrying out the interview with MP Kelloway at our Telile studios in Airashat. If you have any thoughts about what you've seen over the past hour here on Roundtable, or just some suggestions for future editions of the show, I'd love to hear them. You can contact me directly. My phone number is 902-625-8863, and you can reach me by email using the address adamjrcook, cook with an E, @gmail.com. You can also contact Telile Community Television directly with your ideas and your comments. The station phone number in Airashat is 902-226-1928, and the best email address to use is telile@telile.tv. As always, you can follow Telile on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and our YouTube channel features every single episode of Roundtable, including this one, as well as individual segments and interviews from our shows. For example, the entirety of the interview with MP Mike Kelloway is on that channel right now, and we offer the same services for our sister program, Telile 24/7. For now, I'm Adam Cooke. Thank you once again for joining me for this week's edition of Roundtable. I look forward to seeing you again soon with a brand new show. Bye for now.